Beach FM, locals talking to locals.
I was approached to have a chat about a book called Living on Shaky Ground. I thought, well, that'll be interesting, certainly from a scientific point of view, but I was not at all prepared for the book that arrived yesterday. It's a beautiful book. It's full of pictures, full of stories, and here is the man who's concocted this beautiful production. His name is Matthew Wright. Matthew, good morning and welcome and congratulations to you.
Good morning, and thank you.
Lovely, because yes, I was expecting all the science stuff, which is in there, but what has taken me, it's the story as well, it's the people that are involved in this, and the impact it's had on our communities over the years.
Yeah, the story of earthquakes is very much one of people. How they react, how they respond, how they survive, and getting things going again after a major quake.
And I have to say that there's a lot of history here, fascinating history, going all the way back to Aristotle, in fact. So there's quite a history that we've had living on this planet. And, of course, is it true that New Zealand is particularly shaky, that we have got earthquakes is very much part of our psyche in this part of the world?
Yeah, it's part of the landscape here, rather literally. We're on the junction of two crustal plates, the Australian and the Pacific. They're relentlessly grinding together, and earthquakes are not only have always been part of life, they're going to keep on being part of life.
So that's why we're shaky. Is it true that we're also learning stuff all the time? I see this as an expanded and updated edition. And does that mean that we are, as a community and as a science community, that we're learning more and more about what is happening and the implications of it?
Yes, absolutely. The science is an ongoing research, and every event, every earthquake that occurs, they learn more about the specifics of what's going on. And also there is active research being conducted into the major fault lines, like the Hikurangi Trench, for example.
Oh, yes.
And it's an ongoing thing.
Absolutely. So the Hikurangi Trench, some quite serious implications coming out of the research, particularly for the east coast of New Zealand, aren't they?
Yeah, it was a funny thing. When I was putting the book together, I had a chat with a guy from Christchurch who was involved in civil defence work relative to the impact of an alpine fault quake. And I said, I went through it with him, and it all looked pretty horrific and, quite alarming. And I said, well, that'd be pretty bad if it happened to New Zealand. And he said, yeah, but it's not in the league of the Hikurangi Trench.
That gives you pause for thought, doesn't it? Goodness gracious me. Now, speaking of Christchurch, of course, that is the most recent of the major earthquakes we've had here. An enormous impact, not one earthquake, but several, in fact, thousands, tens of thousands of earthquakes, but two major ones. And one of the reasons that it is said that it had such a major effect is that it wasn't appreciated beforehand that Christchurch was at risk, and therefore the architecture did not reflect the risk. Is that correct?
Pretty much. It's interesting, if you look at the history of it, there had been earthquakes previously in Christchurch, but the general assessment in the 20th century was that the bigger risk came from the Alpine fault and related faults around there. So Christchurch was thought to be somewhat out of zone.
Which did not prove to be the case. And therefore, I imagine, since the quakes in Christchurch, there's been a whole lot of new science and new data to work with.
Yes, and as I say, every quake actually brings in more information. The Kaikoura quake, in particular, was an extraordinary event from the scientific point of view, because it demonstrated that interlinked faults can actually fire up and trigger each other.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I was around on the radio at that time, and it was very confusing early on. And the reason was, I think there were sort of 9 cascading earthquakes, and therefore it was very, very difficult to read and to realise exactly what the implications were. So it is, it's literally a moving feast, this one, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And speaking of that particular earthquake, we felt that on the Kapiti coast. Wellington. We always talk about the big one in Wellington. When is the big one coming? Not if, but when. But, of course, we've had the big one already in Wellington, haven't we?
Yes, well, two big ones in quick succession in the mid-19th century, in 1848 and 1855. There was an interesting thing that came out of that when I looked into it, which was that these days, if there's a major earthquake in a city, then you're going to have issues with water supply and dealing with sewerage, getting people water and food, and recovering generally. But back in the settler period, these guys were fundamentally living without any of the services that we've got today. And so they had a skill set which let them cope, if you like, with major earthquakes in a fairly readily. That they're already used to dipping water out of the well. They were used to digging their own long drops. They had, if they wanted light or heat, they had to get a fire. And there's a whole range of skill sets that they had, which just through the generations have sort of quietly gone, because we've got our convenience washing machines and water supplies and all the rest of it today.
So you're saying that they were better prepared or better able to cope with the consequences of earthquakes back then rather than now with our iPhones and with all of the conveniences of modern society?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, these settlers didn't have any of those conveniences, so they had to make do in any case. Their ambition was to have those conveniences, and the original Wakefield settlements in Wellington, Nelson, and so on were intended to be instant cities with all the mod cons that Britain had. It didn't quite happen.
No, not quite. Not quite. Took us a while. And so this Wellington quake, of course, Lambton Quay, this is an interesting thing. Lambton Quay was once the coastline, wasn't it? And there was an enormous uplift with the big one, or one of the big ones. And that's the reason that Lambton Quay is now a little bit inland, isn't it?
Yeah, it made it a lot easier to reclaim the land. There was a naval ship in harbour which was, I don't know how it is that the Navy always turns up, whenever there's a major earthquake, but it seems to have happened here in New Zealand.
Thank God they do.
But they were doing surveys on the depth of the water, and what they found was that the harbour was actually sloshing back and forth.
Sloshing? And
then when it...
Sloshing, so the water was going sort of sideways, was it?
Yeah.
Right,
yeah.
Okay.
About a 20-minute wave.
Wow. So this is fascinating stuff. Look, I'm looking through this book, and as I say, it's not what I was expecting. I was expecting a very scientific treatise, actually, a bit of a tome. This is full of wonderful photographs, and I see that your main discipline is as an historian, and it's wonderful to see the science and the history being intertwined like this. But I suppose in a good piece, they shouldn't be separated, should they?
Well, it's all part of the sum total of knowledge. I mean, that's the thing. And, we compartmentalise studies because people have to be able to specialise and, to become expert. But really there's interlinkages between everything. And so I was pretty much trying to explore that in the book.
I wonder if you could talk to me a little bit about Kapiti's long dance, the slipping slow phenomenon. Is this serious?
Yes, this is something that's new. It's only just been discovered, and these slow slip quakes are a phenomenon still being explored. Now, what happens is you've got the two crustal plates collide, and the one that is diving down into the earth is heated as it goes down. So at the top end, where the heat isn't all that great, you get these standard earthquakes with the rocks breaking and fault lines and so on. But further down, it's a little bit more elastic. And it happens that this is pretty much underneath the Kapiti area. So the plates appear to crawl micromillimetre speeds.
Does that mean that the pressure is slowly being relieved, or is there the danger of a big one because of a slow slip?
As far as I understand the science, the answer is actually both.
Oh.
You don't know. This is still being researched.
Right, okay, so keep a watch on that. We've literally all got a stake in that. We've all literally got a stake in learning more about earthquakes, and I think particularly learning how they cope with them in the good old days, these wonderful human stories. Congratulations on the book, Matthew. I think it's a wonderful book, but this is very important and something that I think should be part of every New Zealander's bookshelf. It's a magnificent production, very accessible, and I congratulate you on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to talk to you. Matthew Wright there. The book is Living on Shaky Ground, the science and the story behind New Zealand's earthquakes.
106.3 Beach FM.